Gauteng is a deeply corrupted government, led by deeply corrupted people. There is an overlap between senior people in government in Gauteng, the most senior people, and organized crime.
Well, it's very rare in civil society and activist circles to have a friendship and a relationship with someone that extends to somewhere around 25 years. Now, that's how long I've known Mark Heywood, from the time where a friend of mine, another social worker, asked me to co-facilitate an organizational learning event when he was with Centre for Applied Legal Studies, I think it was then, hey?
Yep, that's right, at the ASOL project.
And it was before Section 27, was before the treatment action campaign. And I mean, Mark can look back on an extraordinary, interesting career. And I've been very privileged that as I've tried to do what I do as a social worker in terms of human rights activism, to be able to just touch base with them every now and again, and to just watch him and reflect. So that's what we're going to do, is just sit down and reflect a little bit on where he is at the moment in his career and where he sees it going, because he's a younger guy than me and I don't feel like my work's over yet. So I'm looking forward to just teasing out some of the big issues. And of course, we're in a situation in South Africa where today is another country. We now have the African National Congress has not been able to govern with an absolute majority. It's been forced into having to talks and coalitions, and we're still working out what that means in practice. So we're going to just cover a number of topics around what's happening at the moment. Thank you, Mark, for the opportunity. Well, I rushed all the way back from Cape Town because I knew that you were going to Cape Town next week. And I thought, well, there's too much happening now and we need to have some commentary on it from somebody with your depth perspective. Because, the analysts, the media, the op-ed sort of writers are all coming in with their opinions. But it takes somebody with your deep level learning to actually help us really make sense and meaning out of it. How are you feeling now about where things are at the present?
Well, thanks for the kind introduction, John. You got a better memory than me of those 25 years. Look, I have mixed and sometimes quite contradictory feelings. On the one hand, I recognize that there's been a kind of break in the politics that we had become familiar with, and there's opportunity and possibility in that break. The ANC no longer has a majority. We have this government of national unity, and so on. On the other hand, you said in your introduction, we're in another country. Well, yes, we are, and we aren't. It's now more than a month since the election, and the country I see every day hasn't changed, and I don't see any indications of real will to change it, and that's the flip side of the coin. When you know that there are 20 million people who are on a spectrum of hunger, when you know that there are kids dying of severe acute malnutrition in our country, when you know the levels of femicide, when you actually look into the violence and the lives of young children in this country, if you consider the mind-killing unemployment that faces young people, none of that has changed. That country is still there, and that country is getting darker and getting worse. And so for me, what will give me hope is when I see this new dispensation plugging in and showing a will to address that other country. And I don't see it yet. If I was in the government now, I would be saying one of the first things we have to do, and there's no shortage of ideas of what to do. There's no shortage of programs. There's no shortage of money. There's no shortage of people. We're going to go in and address this socio-economic crisis immediately. And this is how we're going to do it. But on the other hand, as you say, the politics has opened up. It could have been much darker. We could have had a much worse political result out of the election. So we have to work this new situation to the advantage. And I say to the advantage of the vision of the Constitution, which is still something that I stand by. You know, a Constitution that's the supreme law that says everyone has a right to sufficient food, everyone has a right of access to healthcare services, everyone has a right to dignity. It's still a lodestar around which we can focus our activism.
Now, a number of people were quite surprised in the circles we move in and overlap in when you popped up with Roger Jardine's Change Starts Now, and a lot of hope and expectation that this was something that could emerge out of the liberation movement generally, but something that would actually hopefully make a difference. Now, it was unfortunately ill-fated. I understand it was largely because the way the Constitution wasn't really allowing people to get going without huge numbers of...
Well, the interpretation of the Constitution
the interpretation
was given by the legislatures, by the legislature, yeah.
And then you popped up with Rise Mzantsi, and the last time we met, you phoned me and said, "Come along, John, there's a meeting with a couple of other people who are advocates for whistleblowing." And we had a meeting with Songezo Zibi, and I was very hopeful and excited that this would lead to something. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to meet and interview Songezo as we hoped. A number of false starts, but it was in the middle of a campaign. Pick us up from there and just tell us a bit about your reflections from having worked at least to do something. And unfortunately, Rise Mzantsi really didn't get a huge kind of support that we were hoping it would.
Well, you've packed a lot into that that question. Let me try and take little bits and pieces of it. My starting point at the moment, John, is that, you know, like you, I've been an activist all of my adult life. We've won important victories and thank God for activism and activists and social justice activists, of which there are many. And, you know, my involvement, for example, goes to something like the Treatment Action Campaign, where we can actually say we've helped to save 5 million lives through activism, through social mobilization, through using the law, and so on and so on. But the thing that has troubled me now for quite a few years is that even though all over the world good is rallying, good is organizing, social justice activists are winning small victories, they're holding the line against depravity, good is losing overall. You know, the world is getting more unequal every single day. The right wing, the fascists, the kleptocrats, the autocrats are organized. It's almost like they've learnt from us, from when we were doing our best activism. And they're getting an echo, and we are not winning. We're not changing the systems in a way that can give us hope. So I say this because, you know, I was starting to realize this in the late years of my work at Section 27. I left Section 27 in 2019, but by about 2014, 2015, it was striking me the world that was giving us victories in the early 2000s was not giving us victories by 2015. At best, we were kind of locked in a equilibrium. Now I think we're losing. So we have to innovate. We have to think. And it brings me to your question about, well, why did I go to Change Starts Now? Why then I go to Rise Mzantsi? I've realized that civil society activists work a lot of the time obviously outside of government. One of the biggest problems civil society activists is that we've got very clever people, we've got great ideas, we've got the ability to mobilize communities, we're connected to academia, we've got all of this, but we don't have power. And without power, you can't change anything in a fundamental way. So the question I've been saying to myself is, how do we get power? Where do we build power so that we have a counterpower to those people who are using power just to get rich and to drive inequality? So I feel that there's a need not to criticize and say what civil society is doing is not working, but to find ways to supplement it and strengthen it. And part of that, I think, means civil society engaging electoral politics in a way that it has not been willing to do up to now in South Africa. And that's why I thought, okay, if there's a chance to build a political party that is based on social justice principles, that is transparent, that is accountable, that is not corrupt, that has a chance of getting some people into government, that can build an alliance with business, with civil society, with poor people, then give it a try, because just doing more of the same is not working. Now, Change Starts Now didn't work. You partly explained why. Rise Mzantsi, I feel, is a different kettle of fish. You know, what struck me about Rise Mzantsi, which did get 3 people into parliament, and it's a tiny number, but it's still critical people entering into that space, was it was beginning to draw in a lot of young people, again, into party politics and campaigning. Particularly young black women impressed me as being at the heart of that organization. So although I'm not working with Rise Mzantsi now, I support that initiative and will continue where I can to put my shoulder to that wheel in the hope that we can get a political party that is connected to civil society, that can wield power in government consistently around these social justice questions or social injustices that blight the lives of 9/10 of the population in the country.
That word power, maybe you can help me sort of come to terms with my own anger of what I've seen happening in Gauteng. Because by definition, a coalition type politics requires that we find alliances with power with. Now, in my social work studies way back, there was somebody called Mary Follett, I think Mary Follett, well. Where she talked about power with and power over. Yeah. And it seems to me that definitively a coalition politics requires to find power with each other, and which means finding something which they have, what they want that power for. And we are seeing this in some extent with the DA and the ANC saying, well, we all constitutional parties, we all committed to those values and all the rest. That's the power for. But yet we see in the ANC in Gauteng a crude, brutal attempt to simply exercise power over. And I just wonder what you make of that. In the context of what's happened at Life Eudemony, what's happened to Babita Deokaran's murder, how can we allow this in our province to continue? So
precisely,
counsel me through this one, because I'm really feeling like very distressed about it.
I affirm what you're saying. Hopefully, at a national level, the government of national unity might turn out to be, as you say, power with, and sharing and exercising, not just sharing, but those people have a lot of power. Those people in government, they have a lot of constitutional power, they have a lot of power of the budget and resources, etc. They have the power to change this country. They do. There's no question about it. Will they use that power? Will they use your power with? Gauteng is a different story. Gauteng is a deeply corrupted government, led by deeply corrupted people. There is an overlap between senior people in government in Gauteng, the most senior people, and organized crime. I could show you a WhatsApp message from somebody I won't name, but who was once very, very senior in the Gauteng government, saying that that person feared for his life, even though he was very, very senior, because he was tackling corruption. So the motivation in Gauteng for this government that has been created with, unfortunately, Rise Mzantsi, and I don't support Rise Mzantsi having gone into Panyaza the Sufi's cabinet, but the motivation is not service delivery. Part of the motivation is just to keep the lid on anybody finding out about the levels of corruption. I mean, you mentioned Babita Deokaran, still nobody arrested for Babita Deokaran's murder. Somebody told me who was in government very recently, she said to me, listen, Panyaza doesn't want to share the key government departments, the following departments: infrastructure development, COCTA, and basic education, because those have been treasure chests for stealing from. So all the motivations are wrong, unfortunately, in Gauteng. So it is power over. And I don't know what will come of it. You know, we as the citizens of Johannesburg, of the whole of Gauteng, need to have a much more sophisticated and organized way of maintaining vigilance and putting pressure on that government to be able to deliver. And again, that goes back to the point I'm trying to make, which is I don't feel that people are exercising their power sufficiently, strategically. You know, exercising power doesn't just mean having a big protest and then your power gets dispersed again, showing your numbers and then doing nothing with the numbers. It means using the numbers in a clever way constantly to put pressure on the people who are wielding the power and to make them increasingly uncomfortable and to force them to govern in a way that benefits the citizens, all of the citizens of this province. And we could do that. There's no doubt about it, because the people in this province, you know, I work with a lot of the healthcare workers, you know, just the healthcare workers alone, if they got their act together, and the people who are working in the big tertiary hospitals, joining up with the people in civil society, etc., could do something. But this is the point I'm making. This is where I'm struggling at the moment. And this is why I believe progressive forces in the world are losing, because we're not building power, a counter power.
But I mean, I can recall at the vigil for Babita Deokaran, David Makura was there. He was the premier at the time, and him promising you that he would making a personal commitment. And I liked him, and I got on well with David, and I thought this is hopeful. And yeah, as you say, you know, 3 years later, what has happened? What has happened? I mean, I've been just get too frustrated about the kind of the slow pace of protection of whistleblowers. I mean, it's 3.5 years since Mandy Wiener's book was published. There was a mobilization to try and overhaul the Protected Disclosures Act then. It hasn't happened. And when I had a run-in with John Jeffries when he was still Deputy Minister, and he said, oh no, in another year we should have it done. Meanwhile, I was getting phone calls from whistleblowers feeling threatened about people, suspicious activities around their home, and they were phoning me. What has happened, Mark? I mean,
well, basically what's happened is that they've arrested all the trigger men, the gang of thugs that were paid money to do the killing, and they haven't got to the person who ordered the killing. And we don't know what's going on, if anything, behind the scenes, but John, you know, the investigative journalism that has been done creates many leads. We know what Babita Deokaran was exposing when it came to places like Tembisa Hospital. We've had the systems of corruption exposed. That there's a video that was made by News 24, you know, which names 4 people as kind of prime suspects. But it seems as if the leads have gone cold. And it will be 3 years, in next month, since the murder of Babita Deokaran. So that's the case in point. But, you know, the thing is, what people tell me is that the Gauteng Health Department is still a cesspit of corruption, and will obviously remain a cesspit of corruption. Because again, you think of the billions that these departments command, and what doesn't get done with them. And then you have to ask yourself, again, going back to Gauteng government, Panyaza, the Sufi's new cabinet, has taken safety and security away from being an independent department and put it in the office of the Premier. What does that say to you? Apart from the fact that the Premier also now directly controls the Amapanyaza, as they are known.
His own militia.
As his own little militia. Potentially his own militia.
Well, what happened with Babita Deokaran and the whole scandal there happened in the context of what happened a few years before, and that was the Life Eudemony scandal. And you were really so wonderfully committed to making sure that there was accountability there. And now we've got this judgment. How does it leave you?
Look, I'm very happy that work on Life Eudemony, you know, uncovering the truth of what had happened, first of all, then getting the health ombudsperson to do an investigation, then getting Deputy Chief Moseneke to do the arbitration. The inquest itself, which ran for over 100 days, has taken 8 years. It's actually 8 years since the day when people from Life Eudemony were moved and started to die in horrible conditions. So it's a tribute to the people, the families, the survivors and the families, that we have got this judgment that you refer to. The question now is, will the National Prosecuting Authority move quickly enough? Because all the evidence is there. Criminal responsibility or criminal culpability has been found. Direct causation has been found. Kaidani Mahlangu, the former MEC for Health, has been named as being directly responsible for the death. So has somebody called Mahoba Manamela, who was the head of mental health care services. So the question now is that the NPA must expedite prosecution. I would like to see Kaidani Mahlangu being arrested fairly soon and charged with culpable homicide. And then what will bound to be a lengthy legal process of prosecution beginning. I hope that she ends up in prison one day, and I hope that sends a signal to every other government official who behaves just like they did, that now there will be individual responsibility. That's the value of this, John. This is a hugely precedent-setting case, because a serving minister has been found to be criminally liable for actions and deaths that occurred as a result of their action. So, big step forward. It's one of the big legal victories post-apartheid and under this constitution.
And the VBS Bank is the other breaking news here, which of course it's really disgraceful about how that was allowed to happen. I just heard somebody, a pensioner, saying, she had saved her money and invested it in the bank. And now she's, actually a little bit cold comfort to her, because my guy might be going to prison and all the rest. But what happened to those assets?
But that's the thing. I mean, this is where we're failing, because all of these victories are cold comfort to the people who are most vulnerable to corruption and exploitation and theft. Go back to the VBS. The people who had their money stolen will never get their money back. And this was poor people who'd invested or put their savings, their retirement money, etc., into VBS. Life Eudemony, you won't get those lives back. But the other thing that worries me about Life Eudemony is that whilst the actual Life Eudemony crisis, catastrophe, whatever you want to call it, was unique in that it was instigated by a MEC for Health, it took place in the context of massive underfunding of mental health care services in South Africa, and a sort of default position where mental health care users, people with mental illnesses, are treated badly and do not get the care that they require as inpatients or as outpatients. That, John, hasn't changed. We're a country, and you would understand the implications of this, with an epidemic of mental illness, epidemics of anxiety, depression, massive undiagnosed mental illnesses, and no budget for it. Not training enough psychiatrists, not training enough psychologists, not making sure that the medicines are affordable, etc. So on one level, the only thing that's happened from Life Eudemony is what civil society, Section 27 and the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, forced to happen by going through the courts. It hasn't, there's no evidence that it's made people wake up in government and say, we got to sort our systems out to provide a decent quality of care.
You have a good view of what's happening globally. I mean, you read a lot, you travel, you go overseas. What are we missing in South Africa that's happening globally that we could probably take more note of?
What interests me about what's happening globally is, when it comes to people like us, the activists, is there's a lot of innovation globally within civil society. We don't hear enough about it because our news is very one-dimensional and focused on sensationalist politics, etc. But movements are innovating in very interesting ways globally, and that interests me. I think we need to do more to find ways to join up with other parts of international civil society so that we learn from each other, but also that we try to build global movements that can tackle some of the crises. Because the world situation is the most frightening situation in your and my lifetime as we sit here in 2024. I mean, you see runaway global heating now taking place. The worst is yet to come, and we will soon feel within years that worst. We're in a time where, of war, and I believe escalating conflicts that will become military conflicts. And yet all over the world, people are resisting. But again, the resistance isn't bearing fruit. I've just finished reading a wonderful book called If We Burn, which is a study of 10 protest movements that shook the 2010s in Brazil, in Hong Kong, in Ukraine, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Syria, in South Korea. But the conclusion of the journalist is that although those were unprecedented in their scale and size, none of them won. The old power, the elite power, the unjust power keeps on reconsolidating itself. And that's why I'm saying movements have got to get brains. We got to get cleverer if we're to have a chance of winning. And we have to win because the scenario, if we continue to lose, is just too ghastly to contemplate. The scenario, if we continue to lose, is mass migrations of people. It's the civil war in Syria. It's what's happened in Gaza. It's what's going on in Sudan at the moment. It's these oligarchs and so on getting richer and richer and controlling the globe's politics. I mean, look at the American elections coming later this year. But we mustn't be debilitated or depressed by it because there is this groundswell. People are experimenting. I mean, I think there's a level of experimentation with different ways of living, different economies, different ways of educating people, different ways of growing our food. Probably never happened before in world history, but we don't see it all. We're just not telling those stories. But there isn't time for it to incrementally grow and become the new way of doing things in the world, because we're in this time of crisis, and because, unlike, say, when you and I were becoming politicized in the 1970s and the early 1980s and so on, there wasn't a thing called the climate crisis sitting literally above all of our heads, independent almost now of human agency, because climate crisis is, we can mitigate it and we can ameliorate it, but we can't solve it. And as one writer says, the heating world is now locked in. Even if tomorrow morning we stop using all carbon and we do everything that we should be doing, the climate won't suddenly clear up and global heating slow down. We're going to have to live with the consequences of what we have allowed to happen over the last 20 or 30 years. And the reason I'm saying this is because you can't separate the climate crisis from its impact on authoritarianism, on social dislocation, on inequality, on deprivation, and so on and so on.
And the climate anxiety, we're talking about mental health issues too. This is a major issue, which I find, and certainly for myself, I'm going to take stock. But you can really help other people if you yourself are feeling like, there is some meaning and hope and purpose in what's happening, and that's worth doing, as opposed to just becoming negative and sort of resigned to it.
We can't resign to it.
What keeps you going, though?
I think what keeps me going is, I'm thinking of writing a book called The Joy of Activism, and breaking activism down into its component parts and telling stories about what makes activism, protest, writing, the different parts. What really keeps me going is people. I find people constantly fill me with wonder and surprise and hope and possibility. And you find that particularly amongst people who are the most disadvantaged. You know, just this week, in 2 days, we're on Friday now. On Wednesday afternoon, I went to meet to a place called Jones Urban Farm in Bosmont, you know, in Johannesburg. Former coloured area, incredibly deprived, gang-ridden, drug-ridden, etc. And here's this man who has carved a farm and a community garden, literally out of wasteland, and is beginning to give hope. And then yesterday I was in Soweto, and I went to a place called Lebo's Soweto Backpackers. And again, in the context of Soweto, of high unemployment, of a lot of disillusion and demoralization, you find these little oases of organization, of people getting things sorted out, building food gardens. And you talk to those people and you just think, wow, you know, you go home, I've got energy again. And that's the story, together with the belief that we have the means.
Getting back with the elections again, I mean, we did have independents running, and I was really hoping Zaki Ahmad would get there. Andrew Feinstein encouraged me to, you know, mobilise and support him. He didn't make it, and that was very much predicated on a movement idea. Now, you and Zaki go back many years. Have you ever yourself considered actually finding another way of getting into those halls of power, to actually get into those committees, to start exercising that power you talk of?
John, you know, at the beginning of this year, I was asked probably about 4 times by 4 different organizations whether I would be on a list. The Climate Justice Charter Movement asked me, Change Starts Now, Borsa, Rise Mzantsi. My answer was the same each time, which was that no. Not because I don't for 1 minute value the importance of getting good people elected as MPs and into those corridors of power, but just because partly I feel, you know, we talk about letting the younger generation lead, and I think we need younger people in those places. You know, I've just turned 60. I don't think that this is necessarily the best, that would be the best place for me to invest my energy at this moment in time. I think my energy is best invested in building and giving power and having discussions with the people who are younger, who are going to have to lead. So that's my approach, and you know, you can agree with it or not agree with it, but there's roles inside Parliament and there's roles outside.
Young people need to have mentors, though. They need to have people that know the ropes. You'd have to join a party, and that in some ways for me has always been a big limitation, is that it narrows you down to a binary, into in some ways an oversimplification of things. Everybody's been talking about a government of national unity. What I actually think, and I'd like your thoughts on this, that we need governance for national unity. And that then led to the question of, well, what are the forces that are creating disunity? And in many ways, the very nature of the party political system tends to polarize and entrench difference. And I feel that the crisis, as you described it, requires something that transcends the system as we know it. What would it take to have a governance for national unity?
Look, first of all, I agree with you. Just declaring something a government of national unity does not mean that there is national unity. Bottom line is there is not national unity. There is a great deal of national antagonism, disunity, anger, hatred in some instances, racism. There's a broth, a bad broth, that makes up a lot of our country. And that broth bubbles because so many people are forced to live in awful conditions, which creates fertile ground for all sorts of movements, populist and otherwise. I think your idea of a government for national unity is better. If I'd been given a choice, I would have said a government for national solidarity, because that's what we need to show. We need to show solidarity across classes, across races, across genders. We need to show solidarity between those who have a lot of wealth and those who have no wealth. And we need to build that solidarity around programs. And if we did that, John, it might answer the second part of your question. I think we have to rethink politics, and we have to rethink political parties. You know, even as I was working in political parties, in my head I was looking at them and thinking, comrades, you're thinking as if the politics of the 2020s is the same as the politics of the 2000s or the 20th century. It's not. And political institutions and political parties are not working almost anywhere in the world. They're not. So at what point does society actually admit they're not working and start thinking about constructing something new? The ordinary people know they're not working. You know, we look at the fact that only 40% of people in South Africa voted, of the eligible voter population, and we want to blame the 60%. I would look at it another way. I would say the 60% are realistic about the fact that this system doesn't deliver for them. And so whilst they won't sit and have discussions like you and me and philosophize about it, they understand the system, and the system doesn't work for them. And that's the case all over the world. Just look at the British general election. I read an article this morning. It was the lowest voter turnout since the suffragettes, since the 1900s. Whilst we've celebrated, and we should, a Labour victory, 4 million people voted for the Reform Party, an avowedly right-wing racist party. In some ways, you know, Britain didn't go left, it went right. But luckily, the disgust with the Tories put a Labour Prime Minister in power. Look at what's happening in France. Look what's happening. But the world is a mixed place at the moment, because I also was talking to some friends from India, and it was a mobilization of ordinary citizens that denied Modi an absolute majority in India in their recent elections. So there's different things going on at the same time, but I feel as if there's a kind of common root. And that common root is that the political systems that were devised and that we continue to try to make work were mostly devised in a world that we no longer have. They were mostly devised at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And it's not that we must throw them out altogether, because democracy is the best system that we have. But we have to ask searing and deep questions about what needs to be done to make it work again. And we need government more than we've ever needed it, because the world has never been, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, in such a perilous place as it is at the moment.
Which I guess brings me to what's been my preoccupation for the last 4 years, and that's working with whistleblowers and power. I often talked about, we say whistleblowers, to use a cliche talk, speak truth to power. I've been concerned too about the truth about power. Because what we're seeing happening here is that whistleblowers get retaliated against because power doesn't actually have a defense against the truth. So it seeks to attack. And the idea of your solidarity is something which has been a very encouraging thing, is to see how whistleblowers have found support with each other against the deliberate attempt to isolate and make them feel like they're on their own. So now that's an important one. And when we met with Songezo Zibi, are we going to see that million signatures? Are we going?
I think, John, put it on record here. Songezo Zibi made a commitment in that meeting that if he was elected to Parliament, that if I remember correctly, he would introduce a private member's bill and seek 1 million signature petition, and on the basis of a 1 million signature petition, push that through Parliament. He said that in a meeting in which I was present with you. So, Songezo, over to you. I've accurately conveyed it, haven't I?
That's exactly what I said. And I got very excited about that, and I honour you for that initiative of doing that, because I mean, he is used to, Rise Mzantsi had to get 45,000 signatures, so they're used to the whole process of mobilizing a signature. And the reason I believe it's so necessary is because on the levers of power, you talk about the Gauteng province particularly, where there's a deliberate retardation effort to try and kick the can down the road as much as possible, because it's not in the political interest of those in power for disclosures to be publicly protected. And that's just so exasperating for me. I mean, the latest whistleblower that I've just come back from Cape Town, we had to go outside this country to find support for him because he'd been unemployed now for nearly 2 years, having exposed, well, Shell had set up this BE fronting exercise where he had blown the whistle on it and said it was a patronage network. He's got a bullet hole in the back of his car. He's been attacked. But still, we had not seen enough real hard commitment into a fundamental change there. So I would want to argue, tell me if you agree with me or not, that there couldn't be a more important thing in this governance for national unity, whatever you want to call it, for all parties to also sign up to a commitment to overhauling the Protected Disclosures Act immediately, so that it's taken out of the hands of the politicians and there's a proper institutionalized.
So, and I absolutely agree with you. But again, it goes back to this point I've been trying to hammer in this discussion, which is thanks to you and to other people like Cynthia, a whole variety of people, we have a whole proposal on how to protect whistleblowers. People, you've thought it out. You know how the law needs to be amended. It's there. The work doesn't need to be done. Parliamentarians just need to say, okay, thank you, John. Thank you, this person, that person. You've given it to us. Now we're going to do it. So you have to ask yourself, why don't they do it? And why, when they don't do it, can we not make them do it? Because we don't have power. And that's the problem that and you just said something very important where you said power, what did you say? Power doesn't have answers to truth. And that's, I think, where things have changed in the last 20 years, because there was a point when power, when it didn't have answers to truth, was ashamed or succumbed or stood aside. Whereas now, power doesn't have answers to truth, so what does it do? It creates alternative truths. It creates confusion. It just shamelessly holds on to power in the face of truths that expose it. And that's a shocking development, because so many of our politicians are just barefaced liars, and they don't care about it anymore. It doesn't matter. You look at the work of the climate justice movement across the world and in South Africa, what's it called, the International Panel of Climate Scientists, etc., putting the evidence on the table, the scientific evidence on the table. Everything is there. Politics doesn't work with evidence anymore. It selects when it wants to accept science and when it wants to bypass science, or when it wants to use science in a particular way. These are some of the ways that our world has changed, that require us as activists to say, okay, well, if they're not going to pay any attention to evidence anymore, if they're not going to pay any attention to truth anymore, then does this particular strategy work? And should we be looking at another strategy? I was thinking the other day, we talk about civil society. I think civil society must stop being civil. For example, I think civil society is co-opted society in many ways. And being uncivil doesn't mean being violent. I believe in non-violence. But it means not going into processes that you can see at the outset are not going to deliver, not getting tied up in endless policy processes and forums and being humoured and being made part of the elite and being made comfortable with nice salaries, etc., etc. Civil society has got to reconnect with anger and outrage at the state of the world. And civil society has got to stop behaving like an elite. It worries me that, and I say this of myself, that we've become an elite. We're part of this little 10% of society, including the politicians, the rich, that have the discussions, the debates that circulate, etc., when the mass of people are left out of these conversations altogether, for the most part, completely left out, which is why they say, okay, I'm not voting, I'm not doing this, why should I? It's not going to bring me a job, it's not going to bring me food, it's not going to bring me safety and security, it's not going to...
There's a guy, American Professor Emeritus, which Brené Brown introduced me to, who's written a book called On Bullshit, where he said the difference between the bullshitter, and he's written, so you're not using it in an impolite term, he said the difference between a liar seeks to keep you away from the truth, but acknowledges that the truth is there, tries to cover it up. The bullshitter is only interested in persuasion to his or her perspective, doesn't action. And he argues that maybe it's more problematic for a society which does not value truth. Social media was meant to be a huge, kind of advance forward. How do you feel about social media now?
You're starting another big conversation. It's complex. We should be using it, and we can use it, all of these platforms, to the advantage of justice, if we are conscious and sophisticated enough in our strategies and understand what is going on in social media to undermine the prospect of achieving justice and achieving equality. Because we are not working effectively, social media does more harm constantly than good. And I say that having, I was recently asked to run a workshop for international activists on social justice, the media and journalism. And as I started researching and looking into it, I began to realize just how much harm social media and the platforms and the people behind it have done to journalism in the last years. They've really pulled the ground from underneath journalism. I mean, in crude ways, I said, if you look at the history of journalism, you can see that from when people started to work as journalists, I mean, journalism goes back thousands of years, but say the middle of the 18th century through until the beginning of the 20th century, generally journalism contributed to advancing the arc of justice. But now social media is turning it in the opposite direction. So again, a challenge that we have to be thinking about.
And maybe that's a thought. Do you see yourself now as a journalist? I mean, your stint with Daily Maverick, you did a great piece of work there in Maverick Citizen.
No, I see myself as a independent freelance activist who uses writing, including journalism, amongst other tools of the trade of people trying to build better societies. That's me at the moment. I'm not an ideologue, but I believe in equality, justice, fundamental human rights, systems of economy and systems of governments that promote that, and I believe that we can build those societies still, but we have to get our act together, because this is another thing that was said in this book. Failure is an option. If you don't do things properly, if you don't think about them deeply enough, if you don't understand what we're up against.
One of the great inspirations for me was somebody who used the term, and he says, if I could ask one thing of a crystal ball, it's not what is wrong and how can I fix it, but what is possible and who cares. And my experience has been that the more people care, the more things become possible. And Mark really has exemplified somebody who actually has lived that ethos. And just looking forward to the next conversation whenever.
Yep. Let's do it once a year. Next stock.